Hi, my name is Dr. Arash Sadeghi, and I'm a lecturer in international business and strategy at Aston University. In this video, I'm going to provide a summary of an article that my co-authors and I have recently published in the Journal of Thunderbird International Business Review. The title of this article is Perceived Export Performance, the Invisible Part of the Iceberg. My co-authors in this paper are Professor Sylvie Chetty and Professor Elizabeth Rose. Professor Sylvie Chetty is currently a visiting professor at Uppsala University, Gothenburg University, and University of Eastern Finland. And Professor Elizabeth Rose is a professor in international business at the University of Leeds in the UK and the Indian University of Management, Udaipur. Before providing a detailed explanation about this article, in this slide I'm going to provide a brief summary of this paper. Export performance is arguably one of the most important dependent variables in the international business research and also for practice as well. And it has been the subject of interest in the literature for decades. However, relatively few studies have explicitly taken the manager's perceptions, their preferences, and goals about this phenomenon into account. In this research, we respond to calls in the literature for more in-depth qualitative exploration of what SME managers have in mind when they evaluate the export performance of their firms. Specifically, this study has two main objectives. The first objective is to provide additional insight into the fundamental question of how SME managers perceive and evaluate their firm's export performance. Particularly, we explore the perceptions of managers with respect to five main aspects: level of analysis, mode of assessment, type of performance, frame of reference, and time frame. In this slide, you can see the details of each of these dimensions. We argue that the overall judgments of managers about the performance of export activities is only the tip of the export performance iceberg. Previous studies have predominantly focused on this overall judgment, which is the most visible aspect of judging export performance. But we argue that it is critical to also understand the hidden process of judgment beneath this tip. And this hidden process of judgment is related to all the mental models that shape the managerial perceptions, and it is the invisible part of export performance iceberg. Lack of attention to the managerial perspective remains an important gap in the literature because managers' perceptions about past performance shape their judgment and strategies in international markets and drive their decision making. The second objective of this study is to explore some of the contextual factors that explain the variations in managerial export performance assessment. We highlighted the role of different factors such as psychic distance, stage of internationalization, and ownership structure. Theoretically, this study draws on two complementary theories: behavioral theory of the firm and the performance feedback theory. Both of these theories emphasize on inside-out approach in understanding the behavior of firms. Basically, they underscore the critical role of managers' judgments and perceptions in the initiation and the subsequent progress of internationalization activities. This study employs a qualitative approach based on in-depth, semi-structured interviews with the managers of 20 exporting SMEs in New Zealand to empirically explore the ways in which they make sense of success, internationalization, and how this understanding translates into actions in the managers' export performance assessment practices. Here I would like to highlight few of the interesting findings of this research and refer you to the article for more details. So I'm not going through all the findings. This is just some of the interesting findings that I would like to highlight here. One of the interesting findings relate to the role and nature of non-financial exporting goals. almost all the interviewees emphasize that financial measures alone are not enough for capturing the whole picture of exporting success because it takes time before investment in non-financial goals pay off and subsequently translates into an improvement in financial outcomes. Our results suggest that managers can tolerate a certain level of financial loss and continue their unprofitable operation in export market as long as they are satisfied with the achievement of their non-financial objectives. Most of the interviewed managers acknowledge that they do not necessarily see low profitability or even financial loss in the short term as evidence of failure. For example, this is a quote from a participant who acknowledged that financial loss is not necessarily a sign of low export performance because it might be the cost of achieving more important non financial goals. Most of the interviewed firms noted that attainment of financial goals gain more importance in longer term. For instance, as can be seen in this quote, one of the interviewees explained that they are tolerant for short-term pains in the hope of achieving long-term gains. Interestingly, even in some occasions, non-financial measures can outweigh financial ones in shaping managerial judgment. In a seemingly counterintuitive case, one of the owner managers perceives a profitable business in one country as unsuccessful, while seeing the non-profitable operations in another country as successful. Please see this quote for more detail. So this example underlines the importance of incorporating managers' goals and expectations and clearly shows how looking from outside using traditional accounting-based performance measures can provide a misleading and distorted picture of export performance. This evidence suggests that a low financial outcome is not necessarily an evidence of low export performance. Rather, it might be the result of an investment that is expected to pay off in the future. Our results highlight the heterogeneity and context specificity of export performance practices among managers and support the notion that managerial perceptions of export performance is subject to interpretations that are shaped by the history of the firm and its goals. For example, a given outcome that is perceived as success by one firm can be seen as failure for another firm, or even for the same firm at a different point in time. This is in line with the notion of ambiguity of success, which highlights the subjectivity in the perception of success by different managers. Therefore, we argue that the appropriate conceptualization of export performance should be dictated by each firm's strategic orientations. Instead of measuring export performance against rigid and predefined goals, it is important to utilize multidimensional measures and account for the objectives that are actually perceived by practitioners and incorporate the variations in the types and importance of export objectives, criteria, benchmark, time frame, all these different dimensions that we discuss about in this paper, both within and between firms. Because for example, profitability may not be the most appropriate measure to capture the export performance of a firm that is actually pursuing other strategic goals such as market share growth. In addition to investigating the perceptions of managers regarding different dimensions of export performance, this study explores some of the underlying reasons for variations in managerial perceptions. This research extends the existing literature by shedding light on different factors such as psychic distance, stage of internationalization, and the firm's ownership structure. These are some of the important sources of heterogeneity in export performance assessment practices. The first key emerging theme relates to the joint role of psychic distance and stage of internationalization. In this study, we found that when studied separately, it is difficult to draw a conclusion about the role and impact of these two different factors. However, analyzing their joint effects lead to interesting results. We found evidence that managers' priorities in export performance assessment change as firms become more established in target markets. However, the findings reveal an opposite pattern of transition among firms that are operating in cyclically distant countries compared to the firms that were operating in cyclically close countries. Among the studied firms, those that were in early stages of internationalization in cyclically close countries tend to place more emphasis on short-term financial goals, while the more experienced and established firms in cyclically close countries tended to pay more attention to long-term non-financial goals. This quotation is an example to show this phenomenon. In contrast, we observe that that firms in early stages of internationalization in cyclically distant countries place more emphasis on long-term non-financial goals, while their attention gradually shifts to more short-term financial goals as they gain experience in these markets and become more established. Another emerging theme in this study relates to the role of ownership structure. We found that owner managers and external managers, or the professional managers that recruited from outside the firms, these two groups tend to perceive success in exporting differently, and they demonstrate varying export performance assessment practices. Owner managers were more inclined towards assessing export performance in long term, whereas external managers were more short term oriented. In addition, compared to external managers, owner managers tended to put relatively more emphasis on non-financial goals. Furthermore, in terms of financial performance criteria, owners tended to perceive profit-related factors as more important, whereas external managers were more likely to perceive performance in terms of volume terms, such as export sales growth. We found that owner managers are more likely to perceive success in terms of lifestyle criteria, such as personal fulfillment, whereas these factors were not as important for external managers. Interestingly, we observed that sometimes these personal fulfillment or personal factors overshadow other business-related goals. In some instances, owner managers may perhaps subconsciously alter their preset goals and seek some sort of superficial satisfaction while persisting with an underperforming operations. This issue is particularly relevant for owner managers of SMEs because they often set goals implicitly and somehow vaguely instead of making them explicit as part of a written business plan. As an example, the owner manager of firm number 13 explained how he continued running business in the US while it was doomed to failure from the first place. Similarly, we noticed that the role of sunk cost effect, which is defined as the tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made, is particularly prominent among owner managers. It seems owner managers are more prone to invest in and linger with an underperforming market despite clear signs that the operations are suboptimal. It might be that owner managers typically have higher emotional attachment and commitment to their business. As an example, please see the code that I've provided here. Some of these findings can be explained based on agency theory, according to which owners and external managers are likely to have divergent interests preferences, and objectives, and may display different behaviors and practices. Although we agree with the arguments of Jensen and Meckling that there is good reason to believe that agents will not always act in the best interest of their principal, however, we also found that owners do not always act in the best interest of their firms as well. Rather, owners sometimes may prioritize their personal satisfaction even at the cost of business-related goals. Finally, I would like to point out that we followed up on this study by building on the conceptualization of perceptual export performance in this article, and we developed a multidimensional framework for measuring the concept of perceived export performance. This framework is introduced in an article that we published in the Journal of International Marketing, as can be seen in this slide. This framework is called IPEP, or Individualized Perceived Export Performance Framework. This framework accounts for various exporting goals, criteria, and benchmarks that individual managers employ for evaluating export performance. In addition, this framework accounts for variations in the relative weights of these different elements for each manager. For more information about this framework, please refer to the article titled Perceived Export Performance, a Contingent Measurement Approach, that is published in the Journal of International Marketing. A comprehensive video presentation for that article is also available in my YouTube channel. If you had any questions about this article, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation.